A little spoiler. I brought the documents and threw them in front of her and said, "What now, dear?" I always knew that sometimes war takes more than it gives back. When you go into battle, you leave something behind. Sometimes it's just a sunbeam on your face or the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the kitchen. But this time it turned out that I lost more than that. My name is Michael, and I am a military man. Service has always been my pride, my calling. At home, Sarah, my wife of 9 years, and our 6-year-old son Josh were waiting for me. Sarah has always been the one who lifted my spirits even in the most difficult times. Her smile was like a beacon in the midst of a storm. But something changed when I returned from another business trip. At first, everything seemed normal. Sarah was smiling, although her smile seemed a little tired. Josh ran around showing me his drawings. I tried to adjust to everyday life, but something in the air seemed different. Sarah became more alienated, more often staying in her thoughts. She began to avoid eye contact, and sometimes when we were in the same room, I would catch myself thinking that she was somewhere far away, even though she was sitting a few steps away. One evening, on my way back from the store, I saw a car in the yard of our house that I didn't recognize. It was an old, worn-out pickup truck that looked like it had already gone through 3 lives. My heart sank, but I decided to ignore it. "Sarah, are you expecting guests?" I asked as I entered the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. "Oh, it's just Joe. He was helping with the garden," she answered quickly, even looking up. "Joe?" I thought. Her stepfather, Joel, whom she mentioned, seemed to be in town. I had always thought he was a strange but friendly man. But why was he here now, and why hadn't he called me? I wrote it off as my paranoia. War makes people suspect even things that are not there. But my inner voice kept whispering that something was wrong. The next morning, Sarah acted as if nothing had happened. She was. She made breakfast for Josh and me, put the kettle on, and even asked how I slept. After answering her briefly, I decided to proceed cautiously. My intuition told me not to push until I knew the truth. The day went on with business, but in the evening I noticed that Sarah was sitting on her phone longer than usual. Every time I walked by, she either put it down or abruptly changed the subject. It wasn't just me who noticed. "Dad, why is Mom on her phone all the time?" Josh asked when we were putting together his construction set. "She must be very busy, son," I replied, but this answer was more for me than for him. I decided to leave it at that and wait until I could check her phone. No, I'm not proud of that thought. But it was stubbornly in my head, like a voice commanding, "You need to know." The next day, when Sarah went to the store, I saw her phone forgotten on the kitchen table. It was glowing with a message. "Can't wait to see you next time. This was the best day I've had in a long time." The message was signed, Joe. My heart sank. I quickly picked up my phone and started looking through my messaging history. Their messages began innocently. About the garden, household chores, some joint plans. But then the tone changed. They exchanged jokes that I didn't understand. Laughter behind a screen where I not. Then there were phrases that hinted at something more. In one of the messages, Joe wrote, "It was a great night. I can't stop thinking about it." And Sarah replied, "I miss you too." I put the phone down. My hands were shaking. My mind was screaming, "This can't be true." But the text messages said otherwise. That evening I tried to stay calm, but every word she said, every look she gave me seemed fake. When she said she was going to go to bed early, I stayed in the living room, waiting for her phone to become active again. And he did. A new message. "I left my t-shirt at your place. I hope Michael doesn't find it. Good night, sweetheart." Every letter in this text burned me like fire. But I remained silent. Not yet. I focused on gathering as much information as I could. The next few days were a real test for me. Everything that had seemed normal before now looked suspicious. Every smile of Sarah's, every gesture of hers caused me not pain, but cold calculation. I was playing a role. I was an attentive husband, a caring father, even joking a little to look natural. But inside I was boiling. My plan was simple. I was going to collect evidence. I wanted to be sure that I was right, and when the time came, I wanted to present her with facts that she couldn't refuse. One evening, when Sarah was in the bathroom, I went to her bag. My hands were shaking as I opened its zipper, but there was nothing unusual inside. Just makeup and a wallet. I was about to back away when I noticed something familiar in the pocket. A t-shirt. A man's, and definitely not mine. The smell of cologne still lingered on her. My pulse jumped. I took it and hurriedly put it in my closet, deciding that I would use it as evidence if it came to a confrontation. The next day, I decided to be more cunning. I asked a friend who worked in security to install a small hidden camera in the living room. Sarah often spent time there when I was busy with Josh, and I hoped she would show something important. My plan started to bear fruit sooner than I expected. The night I said I was going to a friend's house, I left my camera on. When I got back late, I immediately started recording. And here he is. Joe. My stepfather. The scene was so banal that it made it worse. They were sitting next to each other on the couch, drinking wine. At first, it looked like a friendly conversation, but then she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arms around her. I couldn't look away when she raised her head and they kissed. The next morning I acted as if nothing had happened. Sarah noticed my bad mood, but didn't ask. "Are you okay, Michael?" she asked as I was about to walk to the garage. "Everything is fine," I replied, barely containing my rage. I knew I couldn't stand to be silent much longer, but I wanted her fall to be not only painful but also just. That night I did not sleep. I sat in the garage, staring into the darkness, trying to imagine how far they had come. Joe, my stepfather, the man I once trusted, and Sarah, the woman I had vowed to share my life with. Their betrayal was not just personal. It was humiliating. I betrayed twice as a husband and as a son. I was thinking about revenge, not a simple quarrel or a loud scandal. I wanted them to understand how deep their blow was, so that they would not just be sorry, but feel all the pain they had caused me. The next day I started acting. My military service taught me patience and strategic thinking. Revenge, like war, requires planning. I pulled out old photos of our family together with Joe and Sarah. They used to remind me of happy times, but now they were tools. I decided to use these memories to create a semblance of normalcy. "Sarah, don't we invite Joe over for dinner?" I suggested as we cleaned the kitchen together. Her eyes rounded for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "Really? You don't mind?" she asked, a little too quickly for a normal conversation. "Why not? He's your stepfather, and Josh loves him," I lied, barely containing my sarcasm. I could see her thinking. She must have been hesitating, wondering if it was a trap, but eventually she nodded. "Okay, I'll invite him." When Joe showed up at our house, I greeted him as usual. A warm handshake, a friendly smile. "How you, Joe? I haven't seen you in a long time." "Everything is, Michael. It's good to see you home," he replied. His words sounded sincere, but I could see how he was trying to avoid direct. I didn't see anybody looking at me. Sarah, on the other hand, looked a little tense, although she hid it behind polite conversation. My trap started to work. I made sure the evening looked perfect. Good wine, discussions of old times, even a toast to family values. But inside I was boiling. After dinner, when Sarah went to put Josh to bed, I was left alone with Joe. You know, I'm glad you're here, Joe. Sarah often says it's hard for you to be alone since you're divorced from my mother. I chose my words carefully, testing him. His answer was short. Yes, it is difficult. But his nervousness betrayed him. I saw his hand twitch as he reached for the glass. By the way, how is your new job? I asked, calmly but closely watching his reaction. Everything is fine, he replied, but his tone of voice changed slightly. I knew he was hiding something. That was the beginning. My game was just beginning. I was in no hurry. The war had taught me that the best victories are those you win carefully and without making too much noise. My trap was slowly closing, and each new step added to its strength. After that evening with Joe, I pretended that everything was fine. I became an even more attentive husband and father. Sarah began to notice a change in my mood. You seem calm lately, she said one morning as she watched me play with Josh. I'm just glad to be home, I answered. Her eyes searched for subtext, but I remained impenetrable. I decided to study every aspect of her betrayal. It wasn't just about emotions anymore. I collected facts, their messages, their schedules, even the video footage from that hidden camera. Every piece of this puzzle strengthened my desire to make them. To pay off. One day, after staying home earlier than usual, I decided to check Sarah's phone again. Her new message from Joe was short, but eloquent. I'm waiting for you tonight. Doesn't Michael know? Gritting my teeth, I studied each letter. She answered quickly. Everything is under control. Don't worry. She thought she had everything under control. But I knew their world was about to be turned upside down. The next step required help, and I turned to Ryan. We had known each other for many years, and I trusted him as much as I trusted myself. Ryan, I need your help, I said when I met him in a small coffee shop. What's wrong, Mike? His eyes were serious. I told him everything. He was silent as he listened, and then just nodded. What exactly do you want to do? I want them to feel what it's like to lose everything. But first I need all the details. I want to know where they meet, when, how long it lasts. Ryan agreed to help. He had connections that allowed him to get information without asking questions. A week later, I had a picture of their meetings. It turned out they used a small motel on the outskirts of town. Sarah always called it going to a friend's house. Joe, on the other hand, was too confident in his invisibility. That was only part of my plan. I also found a way to contact several of Joe's former acquaintances. Among them was his first wife, who I learned had ample reason to hate him. Do you know that Joe still uses your credit card? I asked her, feeling her face grow gloomy. This was my chance. I knew that an angry man would be the perfect ally. My game was just beginning, but Sarah and Joe were already on thin ice. A little more, and it would crack under their feet. My plan was gradually coming to fruition. I had one goal, not just to expose Sarah and Joe, but to make them realize how deeply they had hurt me. I organized everything to make them feel as comfortable as possible in their lives. Sarah continued to play the role of the perfect wife. Joe acted like a loyal family member, and I put on a mask of indifference. They did not suspect that their every move was under my supervision. One day, 2 weeks before the culmination, I told Sarah that I had another military meeting on the weekend. It's long, but you know how important it is, I explained. She nodded, trying to look sympathetic, but I could see a slight glint in her eyes. This was what she had been waiting for. She was probably overwhelmed by the feeling of freedom. Don't worry. I'll handle Josh, she replied with a warm smile that now seemed alien to me. I left the house, but not for the meeting. Instead, I got my car, parked on a street corner, and waited. When Joe arrived, I could barely stop myself from exploding right there. They were so carefree, so confident in their invisibility. I let them come into the house, and then pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. Everything was recorded. Their hugs, kisses, laughter. I knew this would be the final proof I needed. Meanwhile, I had prepared a few surprises. Through friends, I learned that Joe was hiding the debts he had accumulated by using his mother's name. He also hid from Sarah that he had been fired from his job a few months ago. It took me a while to gather this information, but it was worth it. When Sarah and Joe stayed together, I sent a message to Sarah. "Is everything okay at home? I think you'll want to see this." I attached a photo from my camera to the message, showing them standing together in the living room. Her response was not long in coming. "What is it, Michael? Where are you?" I ignored her. I waited for Joe to leave and went home. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale. "It's not what you think," she began, but I interrupted her. "This is exactly what I think, and I'm not going to take it anymore." I walked past her into the kitchen, leaving her standing there confused. Sarah, of course, tried to explain everything. Her words were confused, torn between justification and remorse. "I was just lonely, Michael. You were away and I was lost. Joe was just supportive." "It doesn't mean anything," she said, trying to hide her tears. I stood silently, looking into her eyes. My heart was breaking with pain and anger. All the excuses she made her words irrelevant. But in that moment I realized an unexpected thought that changed my entire plan. "Doesn't mean anything, you say? Then maybe you can explain it." I pulled out another photo of her and Joe at the motel. Her face was pale. She tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. "I've collected the evidence." "Everything," I continued, my words as cold as ice. "But you know what's interesting, Sarah? It's not that you betrayed me. It's how far you're willing to go to hide the truth." Her face changed when I said the last words. She didn't look confused anymore. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I paused, feeling a gigantic burden growing on my shoulders. "What do you think?" I replied. That night, I reconsidered my plan. Revenge was important, but now I felt something more. Something so terrifying that I could hardly believe it myself. I decided to use her betrayal. The next day I went to a lawyer, but not to file for divorce. Instead, I asked to draw up an agreement that would transfer all financial debts to Sarah. Her name was already associated with the loans on our house, and I was going to use that. Joe, with his debts, was just another cog in my machine. "Sarah, we will have a new beginning," I told her, pushing the documents for her signature. She looked suspicious, but signed them without reading them all the way through. A few days later I met with Joe. "Joe, I know everything, but I'm offering you a way out. Get out of our lives forever, and I'll forget everything I know about your money fraud." His confidence disappeared instantly. He tried to object, but eventually agreed. However, this was only the beginning. I prepared a surprise. I gathered all the evidence, photos, videos, even emails into a separate file and sent it to Josh. 10 days later. Years old. In the recording, I explained that his mom and Joe had betrayed our family and told him why I left everything to her, but didn't keep it with me. It was a most unexpected but long-term reckoning. Sarah was left with the debts, without Joe, and with my silent gaze as I the house for good. I sat in the empty house, surrounded by the silence that had once been my refuge. Now it seemed heavier than any sound of battle. Every corner reminded me of Sarah, of us, of the promises we had made to each other. But now I knew it was all a lie. However, there was part of the truth that I could not ignore. I am not just a husband who has been betrayed. I'm a father. And Josh was the only thing that kept me. I had to be careful. My revenge could not destroy his childhood, even if I wanted to destroy everything Sarah loved. The next day, I went to the motel where they were meeting. I didn't plan to go there to see them together. I already had enough evidence. Instead, I wanted to find something that Sarah or Joe hadn't expected. I started with the administrator. The money did trick. I got access to the list of visitors, as well as to the CCTV footage. I was ready to see Joe and Sarah's faces together, but what I found made me cold. Joe had brought another woman to the motel. This happened several times, on the same days he was supposed to be with Sarah. My hatred for him turned into a sinister pleasure. Now I had another tool for my game. I decided to save this information for later. At first, I focused on Sarah. She still thought she was in control, but she couldn't help but notice how I had changed. "What's wrong with you, Michael? You've become different," she said one night when we were having dinner with Josh. "I'm thinking about us," I answered, and my sincerity confused her. "About us?" She looked wary, but at the same time hoped that it was a sign of reconciliation. "Yes, about us and the future." A few days later, I prepared everything for my main move. I invited Sarah and Joe to dinner. At first she refused, but I insisted. "We have to feel like a family again," I said. Dinner was organized in our living room. Warm candlelight, good wine, the illusion of harmony. Joe looked calm, confident that his secrets remained hidden. And then I hit for the first time. "Joe, you have done so much for our family. I don't even know how to thank you." Sarah laughed nervously and Joe nodded. "This is my responsibility." "Responsibility?" I raised my glass. "Or an obligation to meet other women in the same motel where you were with my wife?" Sarah was petrified. Joe tried to say something, but I didn't let him. "I know about everything. About Sarah and the others." "But there's more." I pulled out the documents that Sarah signed. "Everything we had is now yours alone, Sarah. All the debts, all the obligations." Her eyes widened in shock. "Michael, you can't do this to me." "You did this to me," I interrupted. "And now you will reap what you have sown." But I saved the worst for last. I handed them both a folder. It contained copies of all the evidence, emails, videos, even recordings of conversations. "All of this will be published if you ever try to get back into my life or Josh's life." Their faces were full of despair. I stood up and looked at Sarah calmly. "You've lost everything, Sarah. And the worst part is that you made that choice." With that, I walked away, leaving them sitting in the empty living room. "Are we going, Dad?" he asked, looking at me with his big eyes. "Yes, son. We are starting a new life." I put him in the car and drove away, leaving behind only memories of betrayal and pain, but with the feeling that I had regained control. We left early in the morning, when the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon. My plan was simple: leave everything behind. Josh was still too young to understand what happened, and I will do everything to ensure that he feels the consequences of this betrayal. I rented a house in a small town a few hours away. The location was perfect. A quiet street, the neighbors kept to themselves, and everything looked so ordinary that there was little chance of attracting unwanted attention. Josh adapted quickly. Children always find a way to cope if they are surrounded by love and stability. I, on the other hand, felt that every day the struggle with memories became more difficult. 3 months have passed. Josh and I had settled into our new place. I found a job in a local repair shop, and Josh started going to a new school. We laughed together, watched movies in the evenings, and I began to believe that life could be normal. Until one day I noticed a familiar face. It was Joe. He was standing in the supermarket parking lot, leaning against an old pickup truck. At first, I thought I was imagining things. but his gaze, direct and cold, said otherwise. I did not approach him. Instead, I went back to the car, but I was on fire inside. What is he doing here? How did he find me? The next day I found a letter in my There's no return address on the envelope, but I immediately recognized Sarah's handwriting. Michael, I know you hate me, and I deserve it. But Joe won't stop. He owes you a lot of money, and he used me to get access to your name and resources. I didn't know how far he would go until it was too late. I'm scared for you and for Josh. Be careful. He is not what he seems. I crumpled up the letter and threw it in the trash. Her words sounded like a new excuse, but something about them still left me wary. That night I decided to act. My military service taught me not only how to defend myself, but also how to attack. I started an investigation. Through old friends, I learned that Joe was involved in shady financial schemes, debt, deception, and even a fraud investigation. But there was one more fact that made me cold. Joe went missing a few weeks ago. I mean, officially. One night, as I was putting Josh to bed, the lights in the living room suddenly went out. I felt everything inside me shrink. I've learned not to ignore such little things. While Josh was sleeping, I took an old military knife from my hiding place and quietly moved to the door. In the darkness, I saw the figure of a man standing outside the window, watching the house. Joe, I whispered under my breath. He didn't know I could see him. I turned off my phone, made sure all the doors were locked, and started thinking about how to bring him out into open. It was a moment when I needed to make a move, but not let my emotions cloud my judgment. I stood in the darkness by the door, listening to every sound. Joe didn't move, but his shadow remained motionless outside the window. I couldn't let him leave without finding out what he was up to. Instead of going out the main door, I slipped quietly through the backyard. My knife was clutched tightly in my hand, and every step was deliberate. I knew I couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. As I got closer to the shadow, I saw that Joe was holding something in his hand. A flashlight. He was pointing it at the window, but he didn't move, as if he was waiting for something. I took a few steps forward, keeping my head in the dark. What do you want, Joe? My words cut through the night silence like a knife. He flinched and turned sharply, the light of the flashlight sliding across my face. Michael, you're here. His voice was uncertain, but his eyes were angry. Why did you come? Do you want to take something else from my life? I took a step closer, holding the knife in plain sight. Listen, it's not what you think. He began, but I interrupted. Oh, I know exactly how it feels. You deceived me, used my family, and now you show up here like a thief in the night. Why? Joe lowered the flashlight, his face hardening. I came to warn you, he said. You don't realize what you're getting yourself into. You got me into this, Joe. I took another step, the distance between us now minimal. You have one chance to explain. Joe sighed and gave up. Sarah knew more than you think, Michael. Everything we did was to avoid the people who were after me. She helped me with my debts. I promised her it was only temporary. I laughed, but it was far from merry. Are you serious? Are you trying to make yourself a victim? No. He raised his hands. But they know about you. You were part of my story. I mentioned your name when they asked for guarantees. I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet again. You dragged me into your dirty business? I couldn't contain my anger. And now that has gone wrong, you come here to, what? To warn you. They know where you are, Michael, and it won't stop with me. His words echoed in my head. I knew he could be lying, but I'd take any chances. I took another step toward him, and he instinctively backed away. You will get out of here. And you're never coming near me or Josh again, I said, holding the knife steady. If it's a lie, I'll find a way to stop them. If it's true, then I'll handle it. Michael, it's not that simple, Joe replied, but I interrupted him by raising my hand. You had your chance, and you wasted it. Joe quickly left, disappearing into the darkness. I was left standing outside the house, while my head filled with questions. What did he mean by that? Is there really someone else threatening us? Inside, Josh was sleeping peacefully, and I sat in the dark, contemplating my next move. I couldn't afford to be weak. After that night, I couldn't afford to wait any longer. Joe left me with many questions, but one thing was clear: I could no longer feel safe. Now my main goal was to protect Josh. I took action. In the morning, I enrolled him in a temporary school nearby. For him, it was just a new day, but for me, it was a strategy to buy time. Right after that, I went to the local office of my friend Ryan, a veteran who worked for a private security company. Michael, is it serious? He asked, looking closely at my face. It's more than serious. Maybe it's dangerous, I replied, clutching the folder with the evidence I collected on Joe. I told him about Joe's warning, his debts, and hints of people who might be interested in me. Ryan listened in silence, then nodded. If it is as you say, you need security. And also, you need to know who these people are. Ryan got down to business. He started checking all of Joe's connections. Meanwhile, I went back home and prepared for any. I locked all the windows, set up the alarm, and checked the weapons I kept after the service. On the third day, Ryan called. I have some answers, but you won't like them. Speak, I replied, clutching the phone. Joe was in debt to people who are in it for more than money. This group is a network of fraudsters and kidnappers. And here's the thing, they don't just want Joe. They know about your service and decided that you could be useful to them. My heart sank. Do they consider me a threat or a resource? First, with a resource. But if you refuse, it will probably be a threat, Ryan said. That night, when Josh was sleeping, I left the house and went to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town where Ryan said one of the people in group might. I was ready for anything. Every step echoed in my head, and the darkness around me seemed thicker than usual. When I opened the door, I saw only one man sitting at a table. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were cold. Michael, he said, not even looking up, we knew you would come. Who are you? I asked, holding my hand close to my weapon. We are the ones who can give you a choice. You help us, or you become a problem. I didn't answer, just stared at him. Joe, he's your weakness. But you, Michael, are your strength. We can use you. Do us a few favors, and we'll forget about you and your son. And if I refuse? The man smiled, but it was not a smile, but a warning. Then we will take away what you are trying to protect. I returned home with a heavy heart. I had a choice, to cooperate with people who could be dangerous, or to take matters into my own hands and fight. Looking at Josh sleeping peacefully in his bed, I knew it was going to be a war. I sat in the dark, watching Josh sleep in his bed. His breathing was steady, his face calm. In that moment, I realized that I would do anything for him, even if it meant violating every principle I had once held sacred. Joe had me backed into a corner, and the people he had brought into our lives were ready to take away the most valuable thing I had left. But I was no longer the kind of man let others decide his fate. At dawn, I met with Ryan. We made a plan. They think they are in control, I said, clutching a map of the old warehouse where their main activities took place. But I will make them become the hunter who is trapped. Ryan nodded, taking out a small arsenal of weapons from his trunk. We will do this together, Michael. But remember, this is not just a fight. It's chess. You have to think 3 moves ahead. I smiled. It was a lesson I had learned in the service. On the night we decided to act, I took Josh to a trusted family member's house. He didn't suspect anything, thinking it was just another night out with new friends. "Will you come back for me in the morning, Dad?" he asked. I covered him with a blanket. "Always, son," I answered, squeezing his hand. After that, I went to the warehouse. The darkness was my ally. Ryan was waiting for me, holding a drone with a camera. "We will know who is there and how they are moving before we make the first move," he said. We launched the drone, and a few minutes later I saw the image on the screen. A group of men were inside, their faces serious, their weapons visible. One of them, the same one I had met earlier, was giving commands. "They're waiting, Michael," Ryan said, "but we're going to beat them to it." I entered the warehouse through the side entrance. My heart was beating like a drum, but my mind remained cold. I saw them discussing something around a table. I was holding a small device in my hands, the detonator we had installed earlier. "Hello," I said, stepping out of the shadows. They turned around. Their eyes showed surprise. "Michael, you really came?" "I came to finish this," I said, my hand on the detonator. "You want to make me a puppet? It won't work." The man smiled. "What are you going to do? Are you going to blow us all up?" I came closer to let them know I wasn't bluffing. "I will do anything to protect my son." "And you know that?" A shadow of doubt appeared on his face. "You can leave, Michael," he said. "We'll forget about you, but you have to leave this case." I threw him a flash drive. "This is all the information I have gathered on you. And if anything happens to me or my son, it will go to the FBI. He was looking at the flash drive, and I could see his men straining. "You're cunning, Michael," he said, but his tone of voice had already changed. "We won't be chasing you anymore." I came back for Josh at dawn. He hugged me, and in his eyes was everything I had fought for. We returned home, and for the first time in a long time, I felt calm. Joe disappeared from our lives. The people who tried to use me realized that I am not the one who gives up. But I knew one thing. I would never let anyone destroy our world again.